Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the RIPA webinar organized by CLEAN, the Committee for Law Enforcement Accountability Now. For those of you who don't know, but it's likely that you do, RIPA stands for Racial Identity Profiling Act. Thank you all for being with us today. So the way this webinar is going to go is I will be introducing Carl Tenenbaum, one of the CLEAN members. He will be introducing our guest speakers, and then we will proceed with me asking the panelists, Tamani and Melanie, some questions that we have already in place. And I will direct the questions to each of them. And if either of you have anything to add before we move on to the next question, please feel free to do so. And then after we go over all of the questions, we will open it up to the community for Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like the panelists to address, please type them in the question box on your Zoom screen. So I'll go ahead and start with the introduction of Carl Tenenbaum. Carl Tenenbaum spent over 3 decades as a San Francisco police officer, where he specialized in community outreach and policing with an emphasis on restorative justice and alternatives to incarceration. Upon retiring from police work, Carl continued his commitment to criminal justice reform and police accountability through his work with the Law Enforcement Action Network and as a candidate for Sonoma County Sheriff in the 2022 election, which led to his membership with CLEAN. Additionally, he has spent time in Sacramento lobbying for social justice reform at the state level. Carl, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lorena. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. A large percentage of what law enforcement officers do is investigate complaints of suspected wrongdoing. These investigations often involve lawful and sometimes unlawful detentions. Every detention, whether it is a low-level traffic stop or an arrest for the commission of a felony, deprives an individual of their basic freedom and liberties. These detentions often result in complaints against police officers, with the recurring issue being acts of racial discrimination and profiling by law enforcement. In 2015, in response to growing concerns and years of evidence that law enforcement officers were detaining, searching, and arresting a disproportionate number of people of color, the California Legislature passed Assembly Bill 953, the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, RIPA. AB 953 promotes equal justice and fairness by creating solutions to the problem of racial and identity profiling by law enforcement. AB 953 has modernized California's definition of profiling to account for identity characteristics beyond race, creating a system for collecting and reporting basic information on police-community interactions and developing enhanced training on fair and impartial policing throughout law enforcement. Just as the police are tasked with investigating complaints of wrongdoing, RIPA is designed to investigate and correct discriminatory actions by law enforcement. The RIPA board, as established by AB 953, is a 19-member board made up of community advocates, spiritual leaders, academics, attorneys, and law enforcement professionals. The board's mission is to eliminate racial and identity profiling and to improve diversity and racial and identity sensitivity in law enforcement. We are honored to have with us tonight Dr. Melanie Ochoa and Tamani Taylor, who will provide background on RIPA and how to interpret the annual data from our local law enforcement agencies. They will also present recommendations to assist community members, members of the media, policymakers, and law enforcement leaders to promote evidence-based reforms to eliminate racial and identity profiling and improve law enforcement and community relations. Dr. Melanie Ochoa was appointed by Attorney General Javier Becerra as Director of Police Practices at the ACLU of Southern California. Her work is focused on the use of gang injunctions, surveillance technology, and issues around police discipline. Prior to joining the ACLU, Dr. Ochoa worked as a clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and in private practice as a litigation associate. Dr. Ochoa obtained her PhD in sociology and social policy from Harvard University and her JD from Harvard Law School. Tamani Taylor currently serves as the representative of the California Public Defenders Association to the RIPA Advisory Board. Ms. Taylor has 16 years working with and in public defender offices. Currently, she is a deputy public defender in San Francisco. She has represented clients in juvenile, misdemeanor, felony, and death penalty cases. She's an experienced trial lawyer who has tried murder cases, sex crime cases, and other serious and violent felony cases. Ms. Taylor has presented on topics related to criminal defense both nationwide and statewide. She is a CPDA board member, and she is on the California Lawyer Association Executive Committee on Criminal Law. Please welcome back Lorena Barrera, who will be moderating tonight's event.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for those introductions. Melanie, Tamani, we're honored to have you here tonight. We'll go ahead and start with the questions. So our first question is, why did Assemblywoman, now Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Webster, introduce, and why did the legislature enact RIPA? And Melanie, would you like to address that question?
Sure. Thank you for having me. And I have to say, for any of the attendees, I'm a little bit under the weather now, so please forgive me if I cough or anything like that. I'll try to do my best. So I currently work at the ACLU, but I was not around during the passage of AB 953, but I do know a lot of the dynamics that were at play at that time. So the 2015 bill was authored by Dr. Shirley Weber. The co-sponsors were ACLU, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Dignity and Power Now, PICO California, Youth Justice Coalition, and there may have been some others that are escaping me. It was in the wake of killings of Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, all of which happened in 2014. And advocates in the field were trying to figure out what kind of legislative actions could be taken to try to prevent these acts. And advocates in the field kind of all landed on this data collection as the focus for the legislative advocacy in 2015. And this also came after California Legislature had previously condemned the practice of racial profiling. The Legislative Analyst's Office had found that the California law against profiling was too vague and that officers often did not follow it. So the bill itself included an amended definition of profiling, which, to be clear, profiling is illegal under California law. It is a criminal offense. It's under the Penal Code. Is to mean the consideration of or reliance on, to any degree, actual or perceived race, color, characteristics listed in a specific subject description. So what that basically means is, a lot of people probably already understand and know you can't stop someone just because they're Black or just because they're Latino and they're crossing the street. But the law is actually, you can't even consider that as one of the reasons why you're stopping them unless you're stopping a subject based on a description, a specific description. So if you have someone who is jaywalking and that person is Black, and you actually want to stop them because you think because they're Black, they're in this particular neighborhood, they might be up to no good, that is profiling and that is illegal.
Melanie, before you continue, sorry to interrupt.
For the crime.
Melanie?
Sorry
to interrupt you. It looks like you keep freezing.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I was the only one getting that. So maybe if you turn off your video, you'll get a better connection, and then we'll just listen to what you have to say. Sorry about that.
Okay, hopefully that's better. No problem. Can you hear me okay? Am I
Yes,
lagging?
we can hear you.
Okay. So what was the last thing that I said that was comprehensible? Oh, you're muted, Lorena.
Sorry about that. You were talking about somebody making an assumption that someone jaywalking in a certain neighborhood would be up to no good. That's the last thing that I heard.
Great, thank you. So while they could, if the fact that this person is African American, factors into the reason why they want to stop them, the reason that they think that they have the belief that they might be up to no good, that is profiling and that is illegal. So even though there is reasonable suspicion to stop them for jaywalking, if the actual reason that you're stopping them is because they're Black, then that is an illegal act. Additionally, after you stop them, if you decide to engage in any additional actions, like you're going to ask them if they're subject to probation search, or that, and that is only because they're African American, or only because they're Latino, or because or if you pull them out of the car to search them rather than just giving them the ticket and letting them go on the way. All of these police actions need to be made objectively, and if they're derived based on these protective identity characteristics, that is against the law. So that it created the expanded definition of what racial profiling is, which is a higher standard than what exists under federal law in the Constitution. And it also created a requirement that peace officers have to record every stop that they make, as well as information about the stop, including the race and gender and various other identity characteristics of the person stopped, the basis for the stop, and the actions taken. So the lack of consistent data about what police officers were doing, who they stopped, who they subjected to more invasive actions or uses of force, made it difficult to address concerns about bias, because often personal experiences were dismissed as not representative of larger trends, right? And so the thinking behind the bill was that better information about what is happening, information coming straight from the policing agencies, would be harder to deny what is happening and possible to craft solutions to combat it, right? This was also a time when implicit bias was a very popular theory around policing. Implicit bias, if you're not familiar with that already, it's a form of bias that operates unintentionally and kind of below the level of cognition, so you aren't even aware that you're responding differently on the basis of certain characteristics. There have been many studies showing that people make all kinds of implicit associations with different identity characteristics, race, gender, age, and that even people who share those characteristics are not necessarily immune to associating them with negative attributes, right? Just because you're a Black person doesn't mean you don't necessarily associate Black people and violence, or if you're an older person doesn't mean you don't necessarily attribute an older person with lack of technical capabilities or things like that. In the policing space, some studies show that individuals, including officers, when they specifically study them, would be more apt to view an object as a weapon when it was held by a Black person and quicker to shoot, even if there was no weapon. Also slower and less likely to shoot white people who had weapons. And there are a lot of other implicit bias studies showing different kinds of similar biases. And the thinking was that perhaps the difference that we observe in the treatment of individuals was attributable to implicit bias. And trying to interrupt that bias will lead to better outcomes. So that is where you also saw a lot of focus on anti-bias trainings and understanding the effectiveness of anti-bias trainings combined with this data collection. And from a practical standpoint, also advocating for change around policing, it becomes even more difficult if you come in saying all of your officers are racist, which is what they tended to hear when folks would point to the disparities. And then you get into an argument about who's racist and who's not. And implicit bias kind of allowed the conversation to move a bit more, because it was based on kind of everyone has these biases that are derived from society, and your officers are suffering just like the general population, so we need to actively work to combat these processes. So it avoided the racist or not conversation while still moving forward to address these disparities. And so with the RIPA data, we had formal observations of a lot of disparities and who stopped and how they're treated after being stopped. And this is really consistent with about every policing agency that has collected data in the past, usually required as a term of a consent decree or settlement. And unfortunately, the trainings that were intended to reduce bias conduct haven't really been shown to be successful in doing so. We don't know exactly why, whether it's because they're not including the right material, or if that is just something that can't really be fixed through trainings. However, as we've had multiple years of the RIPA data with little or no movement on kind of who stopped and the actions being made, we on the RIPA board and also advocates more generally have shifted focus on trying to adjust an individual's officer behavior, and more focus on structures and rules and policies that just reduce the number of contacts that police have with the public, and particularly the room for discretion and actions, because that's where we see the most disparities. But having the data both at a statewide and local level has been very useful in supporting all of this advocacy. That's a long background of saying kind of where we are, how we got here.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Tamani, did you have anything to add?
Just that, what, as Melanie was saying, when we were able to introduce implicit bias, we were able to move the conversation along a little bit better. It's still kind of difficult. But if people recognize that implicit bias is just a form of socialization, it's how we're socialized, it's the images we see on TV, in movies, gender norms, mom stays home, dad goes to work, those kind of those things are being kind of embedded and ingrained in us I think infants at about 2 or 3 years old have been shown to have adopted implicit bias based on being socialized in the way that we're kind of structurally socialized in the United States of America. And so, the important thing for everyone to know is it's not necessarily about race only. We have biases about all kinds of things. If you see a picture of a cockroach, you're probably gonna go, ugh, that's an implicit bias, right? We've been socialized to and you see a flower, you're like, oh, we've been socialized to value things and devalue things based on how we've been socialized, based on what we've been told since we were able to perceive, which is very, very early on at a young age. So once people can accept that and breathe and say, okay, maybe I should look at what's going on with me, you can understand how police officers can, open up and understand what things they may need to work on in order to make sure that community is safe. They are having a good relationship with the community. And so, I think that's very important to just make sure it's on the forefront of the thought process.
So you think law enforcement basically can use the identification of these biases that are shown through the data that's collected from RIPA to kind of address and change the behavior of how they're performing their work in the community. Okay. So next we'll go to a question about data collection and who is the data collected from and what data is actually collected. And let's see. Can you, Melanie, maybe you can address that one?
Sure, yeah. So all agencies that employ, sorry, I keep getting pop-ups on my screen. All agencies that employ peace officers, so that ranges from police departments, sheriff's departments, but also like school police and park police, or any other entity that employs peace officers, has to report every stop that they make. And that includes if you only have one peace officer. And so every stop is defined as any detention by a peace officer of a person or any peace officer interaction with the person in which the peace officer conducts a search, including a consensual search of the person's body or property in their possession or control. So anytime an officer detains someone or searches someone, even if a consensual search needs to be collected as a data. Individual officer making the stop to report the stop and what occurred. There's supposed to be different, built-in reviews and whatnot by the local agency, whether that's having a spot audits to see if officers are accurately recording the data, or just seeing if things even make past the, even makes sense as terms of what type of data is coming back. But that can happen or not happen depending on how the agency decides to move forward. I think I saw one of the questions in the chat was provisions that enforce the requirement that officers accurately record. There is law that could be used to criminally prosecute officers who don't follow the law because if they are willfully violating a duty. That has never been pursued and only a prosecutor could bring that. So if the individual ACLU could not bring that case. It's a criminal claim. No one else other than the prosecutor has the authority to bring that. The data collection includes the perceived race or ethnicity, gender, and approximate age of the person stopped, as well as whether they have limited English fluency or disability, including a mental health disability. They should collect the time, date, and location of the stop, the reason for the stop, including whether it was in response to a call for service, or if the stop was totally self-initiated by the officer. The result of the stop, such as no action, a warning, a citation, arrest, property seizure. If a warning or citation was issued, the basis. If an arrest was made, the offense charged. Actions taken during the peace officer during the stop, including whether they asked for consent to search, whether they conducted any search, and if they did, what kind of contraband, if any, was found, whether they seized it, etc. The DOJ also recently amended the regulations to include housing status as another element to be collected. So of unhoused people and what's the result there and what type of trends are we seeing with those stops. And it also recently removed discretionary stops on transit, basically transit sweeps essentially, from the definition of stops, which I don't think is a particularly good idea because we already know that that is a very discretionary action that results in a lot of disparities in its execution, but agencies will no longer have to report that. And so individual officers are required to report this data after every stop. Some use a DOJ online portal. Some agencies have created systems that work with their existing data collection tools or have created standalone versions. And the agency is required to report the information to DOJ once a year. Some agencies do it after every stop it's being sent to DOJ. Some do it monthly or every few months. So the DOJ never has the full data set until the reporting deadline. And then the role of RIPA is just to put together, the board, I should say, is to put together a report every year, analyzing that data and providing recommendations to the legislature, local agencies, and others about how to address observed issues in the data.
And just to follow up on that, you said there are different systems that are used to record the data. Do you think that can lead to any errors in when the submission of the data is then sent over to the DOJ?
So there's actually, I think, that is one place where there's actually data control or quality control that's been enforced by the DOJ in terms of making sure that once the data is entered, it's not altered and things like that. But that all still depends on the accuracy of the information going in. So it's less a question or concern about it being improperly transmitted or errors occurring there, and more a question of whether or not the officer has accurately recorded what actually went on in the stop in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and go to question number 3. What does the data show about who is stopped by law enforcement? Melanie, did you want to address that one?
I think I can address that one.
Okay, Tamani, go ahead.
Yeah. So, you know, really what we're dealing with and addressing is two kinds of stops, and really one type of stop is the most used stop by police, and that's traffic stops. So you have traffic stops. There are 8 categories of stops, but over 80% are traffic stops, and then there's like 10% reasonable suspicion, and then the other 6 make up less than 3% of the reasons for stops. So we're really, kind of focused in on what the traffic stop, what the data says there. At least that's what I'm focusing on right now. When we're talking traffic stops, I just want to define it. It's pedestrian stops, bicycle stops, as well as vehicle stops, both moving violations or equipment violation as part of the stops. And so I have some of the a few main graphs or diagrams that are in the RIPA report, just to kind of show the trend of what really across the board, the state of California, with the law enforcement agencies inputting this data and collecting this data, for the most, it is overwhelmingly showing that Black and Latinx Hispanic people are stopped, searched, and detained at much higher rates than they make up in the general population. so it's not only like they're being stopped more, it's that when you use the multiplier by having them make up less of the population, Black and brown people making up less of the population than comparison to the rate at which white people are being stopped or detained or force is used. It paints a bigger picture of the disparity. It's not a small disparity, it's a fairly large disparity. But I will, if I can share my screen. Yeah,
you can do it.
Thank you. Okay. I think this is the first. Yes. Okay. So these are all graphs that are in the RIPA report. And so basically this is a graph of the percentage of stops of the various racial and ethnic groups. And so you can see on the right side, they have all the different ethnic groups. And if we want to look at overwhelmingly search, you can see all the way at up to 20% is Black people. Curbside patrol, car detentions, again, the highest people with the ethnicity or race being detained in their car is at 18%, and that's Black people. Handcuffed, a little under 16% Black people. And these are kind of overwhelming majorities of things that are happening to Black people when they're the subject of a traffic stop. And being ordered out of the vehicle, things like that. And so anytime there is interaction with law enforcement, especially if you're Black, is a much higher likelihood that some sort of force is going to be used, lethal, less lethal, and less lethal force. And then you can see in comparison, Black, then if you look at next to on the slightly lighter color, kind of orange, that's the Hispanic and Latinx population. So they're pretty high. And then the purple is multiracial. And generally, when you're talking multiracial, you're talking about somebody who's mixed with Black. It's like, or they're a brown person. That's the nature of, I think that's the nature of the kind of multiracial thing, is that they're not just talking about somebody who's Irish and English, or Irish and German, or something like that. So as you can see, kind of the overwhelming number of people that are being detained and actions being taken during a stop is majority Black and brown. So this is kind of comparing the California residential population and the RIPA stops. And so as you can see, Black people make up 6% of the California population. However, the data that's collected, 15% of the 15% of the stops are occurring on Black people, even though they only make up 6% of the population. And then use Latinx, 36% of the population, yet 42% of the stops. Whereas if you see it on the right, white people, 35% of the population, yet only 31% of the time being stopped. So as this is reporting across the state of California. And so this is a trend that police officers are reporting on themselves. This is not some outside entity saying, oh, we've audited you. These are police officers reporting the data as they're required to by the law. This is kind of, this is the unweighted comparison. It for the most part is similar. Search and discovery rates by race. So this basically is saying this is the amount of time people are searched, and this is the amount of time things are discovered on the people when they're searched, broken up by race. And so as you can see, while you have white people being search rate being very low, a little bit over 8%, most of the time when they are searched, upwards of 25%, there's something discovered on the something discoverable, contraband, whatever is being look for. But so you can see how while they're being searched less, much more contraband is being found on them and other races, but yet Black people are searched at much higher rates, even though they're kind of on equal plane of when of all the other races of when contraband is actually discovered, right? So there's there's this heavy searching of Black and brown people, yet they're only finding contraband the same amount they would find any other race that they stop when they stop them. This is kind of the differential of the search rate and the discovery rate. So while 10.9% of Black people are searched, 1% of the time contraband is found. While, and then as well as Latinx, Hispanic, 3.5% search rate, yet negative 2.3% contraband is actually found when searched. So as you can see, this disproportionate searching of certain people leading to very little, it's not the kind of the bias that goes into wanting to search Black and brown people doesn't actually flush out when you compare it to the general population. So here's talking about use of force. So anytime Black and brown people are stopped, and have police contact in the field, especially traffic stops, like I said, that's pedestrian, bike, driving. They may be subject to the use of force. And so there's lethal force, which is like the discharge of a firearm. And there's lethal force, like using in a taser or something like that. And then limited force is kind of like pulling someone out of the vehicle, having physical contact, having to, sweep them onto the ground, things like knee sweep them on the ground, things like that. You'll see. And as you can see here, this is lethal force. So this is gun discharge. As you see, African American and Hispanic, Latinx, and the multiracial, which is also brown, very high rates of having lethal force used against them. So this is data collected, like I said, by the law enforcement agencies themselves. They're reporting on their own behavior. So this is where there's a stop of a person, and then the police officer's like, can I get consent to search your car? Even though it's like a regular traffic violation, a speeding ticket. So officers ask for consent search of Black people at a much higher rate. It's a 4.3% higher rate, 4.3%, which is 4% higher than white people. Latinx, Hispanic, 2.5%, which is 1.2% more than white people. They're asking, can we search your car? Can we search your, can we search your person? Can we search your bag? Things like that. So here we have, officers asking for consent to search. And this is the rate of discovering contraband when doing a consent search. So Black people, again, much higher rate of giving consent to search, yet the discovery rate is very low. It's 6.8% versus what do we have? Let's see, where we have white people being requesting consent search 4% of the time, but there's discovered 19.1% of the time contraband or something is discovered upon their person. So there's the implicit bias is, well, this is a Black person, they probably have something on them, I'm going to search them, but lo and behold, really don't find things don't find contraband very often. Whereas as a white guy, probably not do anything wrong, probably don't need to search him, I let him go. But when you do actually search and consent, they find the contraband. So there's a disparity when you're talking bicycle related violations. Here you can see that Latinx, Hispanic, and Black people and multicultural people are stopped for bicycle on their bicycles for various traffic violations at a much higher rate than other races. And here, this is the subjecting people to search, detention, and handcuffing for these bicycle-related stops. As you see, Hispanic, Black, and multicultural have the highest search incidents when stopped. They have the highest curbside detention or being put in the back of a police car, and they have the highest rates of being handcuffed when related to other races without any real, there's no logic to it, there's no reason for it other than there's this perceived threat from a bias that's being held by the individuals in law enforcement. These are pedestrians, you know, in the roadway violations, as you can see. Black people, even though they make up, you know, only a fraction, you know, I think it was like 16% of California residents, while white people 33% or more. Black people are being stopped at the same rate as white people, even though they make up less of the population. And then also Hispanic and Latinx, slightly lower, but still, and then you have the multiracial, which is also brown. So this is stops for community caretaking. This is kind of the juvenile aspect of it. So I thought it would be important for people to understand that this not only impacts like adults, it impacts people under the age of 18. And between 10 and 14, there is a high number of police interactions with youths between 10 and 14, and the same racial trends are part of, you know, are there. So Black kids between 10 and 14, much higher rates being contacted for community caretaking than white children the same age. And then here you can see it's very interesting because it's kind of like as the age increases, the amount of action the police officers take against the child goes down. So there more action for the younger the child is when they have police contact. And so one of the important things about this is that I'm sorry, this is a different, there's no action actions taken when they're younger than there was when they're 25 and older. And so this is important because, you know, children, Black children, brown, Latinx, Hispanic children are often viewed to be older than what they are. And so any interaction with police, and the more interaction with police, the more likely that, you know, there is a possibility of being tased, you know, beaten, things like that, killed. And so, you know, this is data that's being collected from law enforcement agencies, and you cannot deny the trends. As you can see, Black children higher, you know, they're stopped at a pretty high rate as to, and no action taken, meaning they just get stopped and then the police officer says, okay, go on your way. I have nothing, no reason to, you know, there's no crime, I can't cite you, there's nothing, they kind of move them on their way. And then here's kind of handcuffing. As you can see, between 10 and 17, a lot of handcuffing of youth, especially Black and Hispanic youth, higher than all the other races. Detention in the car or the curbside, higher rate for multicultural, Black and Hispanic. And then being searched, again, very high for Black and Hispanic children between the ages of 10 and 17. And these are kind of, you know, the other aspect of kind of these stops and things like that is school, where you have the school resource officers in schools, and kind of the impact it has on children based on race. Black students were referred to law enforcement at a rate more than 4 times that of white students. Native American students were referred to law enforcement at a rate more than 2 times that of white students. And Latinx students were referred to law enforcement at a rate 1.5 times of white students and students with disabilities, which is another thing, another aspect of data being collected is disabilities, and students with disabilities are reported to law enforcement at 3 times the rate of students without disabilities. And then you also factor in race, and those multipliers, you know, occur. And the report has some of that information in there and the graphs. So that's really the that's kind of an overview of the data, and why it supports the fact that law enforcement is disparately impacting Black and brown people.
Thank you, Tamani. That was a lot of information. Really great job. Yeah, it definitely shows a lot of patterns. Okay, we
Can I
have
add super quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, Melanie.
So that was a great overview of the statewide data, which is all that RIPA board analyzes. Us as ACLU has also performed individual agency level analyses, and the public is totally able to do that themselves. This is public data. So the public can request via a Public Records Act request this data from your local agency, and then you can do your own analyses or partner with folks to do analyses and see what the trends are in your own actual community. And one thing, just reporting real quickly on some of the things that we found for the LA Sheriff's Department, was that the majority of stops, 89%, are officer initiated rather than calls for service. The vast majority of these stops are for traffic violations, 84%, which accounts for 79% of an officer's time making stops. We did a quick and dirty kind of cost analysis, taking kind of 79% with 79% of officers' time making stops. We took 79% of just the patrol division budget. So even though a stop can have ripple effects on lots of different parts of the department, because you have to maybe investigate things to follow up, you have administrative staff that maybe has to do data entry, you have supervisory staff that may have to follow up. We just looked at the budget of the patrol unit, and so if we presume 79% of deputies' time is about 79% of the budget also, that is $776 million. So LASD has spent $776 million to make vast majority of traffic stops. 12% of deputy-initiated actions are based on a claim of reasonable suspicion. So that's the belief that there may be a non-traffic crime occurring. And 21% of these are for suspected infractions. And infractions are minor violations that cannot possibly result in jail time, like jaywalking or sitting in public, only citation. And 55% are for suspected misdemeanors, which are minor crimes that can result in no more than a year in prison or jail. 24% are suspected possible felonies. So in total, only 2% of stops by LASD deputies are for things that are even suspected to be felonies. And only 35% of reasonable suspicion stops result in an arrest. 20% result in no action, not even a warning. So 76% of stops made on the basis of reasonable suspicion that a crime might be occurring, even if they are right. The suspected crime is an infraction that at most results in a fine or a misdemeanor, such as loitering, which was the most frequent stop basis for LASD. So this closer look at how officers spend their time and these kind of trends contrast significantly with the larger narrative of how police spend their time. And we looked at different police sheriff's departments, and they all had the same general trends. And this is consistent with the RIPA data, but it kind of looked at some different pieces than the report itself looks at. So this is just kind of...
I'm sorry, Melanie. I think we lost you there. Melanie?
Sorry, I froze for a minute. What did you say?
I think we lost you. Probably the last maybe 20 seconds of what you were saying.
Oh, I was just saying this is these trends were the same across all of the sheriff's departments that we looked at. It's consistent with the larger trends that we see statewide, but this report looked at kind of a little bit of different things than the statewide RIPA report tends to look at. So this is just on top of everything and all the trends that Tamani walked us through. This is also kind of what's going on in local agency, but you could also take a look at your own agency by either requesting the information from the agency directly or from the DOJ. Might be faster if you do it with your local agency, but that was built in as a part of AB 953, was that the public would have access to this information so that more folks could do analyses and take closer looks at their local jurisdiction.
Thank you. Is there any way to use the data to determine if there are correlations between income levels and individual stopped and how that relates to race? For example, if law enforcement officers pull over people for things like broken taillights or registration issues or speeding, isn't it likely that people with lower income levels have more of those types of issues due to their economic status? Maybe speeding from getting to and from multiple jobs, not having enough money or time to fix a broken taillight. And then people with higher levels of income typically have less to juggle as they have more stable lifestyles and therefore aren't having to avoid addressing issues that tend to lead to a traffic stop. And also maybe officers are patrolling more in lower income communities. And can any of that data be used for that kind of theory?
I can take the first step at this one. So there's not enough info in the data to assess the stops on an individual level. So there's no measure of socioeconomic status or income that the officer has to report. There's really no way that the officer would be able to know that because, again, this is all based on perception or officer action, reporting their own actions. However, the data does show the location of a stop. So it's possible to tell which neighborhoods are most likely to be targeted, what types of stops happen where. Although I don't know of any analyses that specifically look at stop patterns by community socioeconomic status. They might have looked at that based on community, but not necessarily community by SES. And I want to just comment that while some of the things that you mentioned are potentially more likely to be present for individuals with lower income, like having a broken taillight for an extended period of time, it's not as though the police are just going out trying to find all the broken taillights and low income folks are unintentionally bearing the burden of that prioritization, right? These stops are largely discretionary. And even though they might not be able to stop a higher income person for a broken taillight, they could be speeding, they could be changing lanes without signaling, they could have too heavy tint, have something hanging from the rearview mirror, if they chose to do those stops, right? One real quick just anecdote, one of the former co-chairs of the RIPA board, who was a lot member of chief, I think in Gardena, was discussing kind of some of the training with members of POST, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. And they were talking about using jaywalking as an example of, disparate stops. And the chief said, no one stops anyone for jaywalking. And two members of POST, which is like essentially a law enforcement entity, who were Black, raised their hand and said, I've been stopped for jaywalking. So this shows you that it's not just who was doing the thing, it's who was being stopped for the thing, because the basis of the stop is really incidental to the stop itself. And even interviews with command staff at agencies, particularly I know the LASD has said, they've admitted that these stops are for the purposes of trying to find weapons, which they find, at least for LASD, in less than 0.5% of the time they conduct traffic stops. So yes, in theory, there are certain types of stops that or infractions that people of lower income are more likely to experience, but that is not the cause. Those are just the things that are chosen to be searched for and stopped for.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to what problems have arisen from collection of data and how have these problems been uncovered? Tamani, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. There are some auditing ways that, that can, that determine errors in data collection. For instance, there is, the RIPA data is sent, over via a different software than just the report, the police agency's reporting requirements to the DOJ at large. And sometimes when those are kind of way off, it's like there were zero use of lethal force or what have you the whole entire year. The DOJ has, it's reported to the DOJ, not necessarily to the RIPA portion, but to DOJ. And so you can see where there's discrepancies there. Sometimes there's also third party agencies that will, help, will challenge the results, which would, kind of sends a red flag. But there's been underreporting or misreporting. We recently had a San Francisco police officer who was investigated and for just doing that underreporting. Basically based on the makeup, racial and ethnic makeup of the community of San Francisco, it was impossible for him to have, it was impossible based on ratios and things like that to have only stopped, white people for 2 months. It was kind of like one of those things where it's, not, something that was kind of obvious, and then there sometimes there'll be misreporting or underreporting will be discovered via, they put one thing in the RIPA data collection, and then in the police report they write the true race of the person. So so there was a little bit of time when we were in this, when RIPA was the data was being collected, where there were these broad categories and officers weren't sure that they categorize some data in the wrong area, or weren't sure how to weren't sure what category should put a particular stop in, or a particular action taken. And there was trainings and efforts made to kind of create much more user-friendly programs to enter that data. So it's going to happen, but even where the reporting is always underreporting, so it's always trying to kind of skew the the data to being like it was less Black people, more white people, or some other ethnicity that's not generally used, but generally more white people. And even then, even in those attempts, even when people, even with police officers reporting and misreporting and intentionally underreporting, the trend is undeniable, for those people who are reporting and doing the best they can to report as accurately as possible, those police officers. So, even the efforts to try to skew will be skewed in favor of, of not trying to overrepresent Black and brown people, but trying to underrepresent Black and brown people for traffic stops and arrests and use of force and things like that.
Yeah, go ahead, Melanie.
So in Los Angeles, as I mentioned kind of earlier, there's kind of limited ways to enforce the data accuracy. One of the means of at least identifying if they're inaccurate is what Tamani alluded to with third parties. So the Inspector General's office for both the LAPD and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department have done kind of audits of the data. LAPD, they looked at body cams of officers when they made stops and compared that to the data they reported. In that analysis, they found that actions and stops were underreported for Black and Latino individuals. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was even more prominent for like the gang unit, more actively undercounting the number of like Black and brown folks that were stopping. LASD, similarly, they compared the data reported to RIPA with the internal CAD data that the agency collects for its own missing significant amount of data. And I believe 6% of the missing data was stops of Latino individuals. So the vast majority of individuals who are missing from the data were people of color. And so to Tamani's point, despite these kind of errors in the data, all of them would bring the level of disparities downwards. So what we're seeing in the data is probably undercounting the amount of disparities that we're actually experiencing on the ground. And so that just should further underscore how important, how severe this problem is, because of all the errors kind of falling in the same direction.
Thank you. And just out of curiosity, are there like certain regions, or is this like throughout the state where you're seeing the misreporting and underreporting kind of patterns?
It's really hard to say because there's limited access to the kind of mechanisms that would allow you to do that test. So if there's not already an inspector general's office that has access to every officer's body cam, but they can audit against what happened in the stop, or access to the CAD data that the agency collects, you have really no basis to make that comparison because you don't have any more accurate number to compare it to. But that said, sometimes the data just doesn't pass the smell test, right? So there's instances where CHP makes traffic stops that result in an arrest, but there's no mention of removing a person from the car or other actions that have to be taken between a stop and an arrest. In LAPD, I think around 50% of those that were removed for 5150 holds for psychological evaluation did not state that the officer perceived them to have any mental health disability. So are you actually sending, hundreds of people to 5150s when you don't think they have any mental health disability, or are you just failing to acknowledge that these people are having a mental health problem that you can that's apparently observable to you? So a lot of this is, again, like passing the smell test, comparing it with what other data we have, and internal inconsistencies with the data. But in terms of actually getting the accurate underlying number, that's really only possible when you have something like body cams or other stop data to compare it to.
Okay, thank you. We've heard criticisms from law enforcement agencies and law enforcement personnel about RIPA data. Could you address those criticisms?
I've heard a few things. I think one important frame for understanding the nature of the criticism is that it's in response to really try to undermine the validity of using the RIPA data, because it has been used very actively in recent years by the legislature to address issues around policing. It's being used by local agencies, and I think there is a kind of coordinated effort, and you can tell when you actually look at the statements that are being made to try to undermine the validity of the data itself, because they don't want the actions taken that kind of result from this data. One of the issues that I've seen repeated is that it's flawed because it's based on officers' perception, and that might be incorrect, but perception is what is relevant, right? Because if it's truly what the officer perceived, if you think someone is Black or someone is trans, and that factors into your reason for stopping them or choosing to ask them questions about their probation status or whether you ask them for a consent search, then that's what really matters. It doesn't matter that that person wasn't actually what you thought it was. You thought you were acting upon a trans person or a Black person or a 14-year-old, because and that's how you determine what actions you're going to take. And so I think that is the relevant and most important comparator. And one of the other issues that I've heard raised most recently is concerns about comparing to demographics of the relevant jurisdictions, because it doesn't account for people traveling through the area that aren't included in those demographics of the local populations. So the RIPA analysis uses the American Community Survey from the census, which is a more frequent collection of certain demographic data. It's the standard used in almost all social scientific analyses that rely on local demographics. As Carl mentioned, I have my PhD in sociology and social policy, and I use that data for my dissertation. So it's definitely a reliable source that is used. There's unfortunately no data that would accurately let you know the exact demographics of people who are traveling in public. So the ACS data is the best that we have, and it's used in a lot of contexts. But you could not possibly explain away the observed disparities in the data based on individuals driving through communities where they do not live and being stopped there. There would have to be Black people just constantly driving up and down the state, being stopped in every city and county to make sense of these significant disparities. And I don't ever hear any real solutions as to what is a better comparator. So I think we have to, use what we have and make reasonable analyses. But I don't think there's any reason to think that this could be driven by the type of individuals passing through that it would need to be.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna ask one more of our questions and then I'll move on to the questions submitted from the members in the audience. How can law enforcement leaders use the data collected from RIPA to incorporate changes in their agencies? And what sorts of changes would you recommend be implemented in the way that law enforcement conducts their day-to-day activities? And
I
Melanie.
will defer to Melanie for this one.
Thanks. So I mean, going back to what we said at the outset, right? Limiting contact, because I think the data has shown that when officers have discretion in stops, that almost always works to the disadvantages of communities of color. And there's no apparent positive impact on community safety. Last year's RIPA report, we did a significant analysis of the data that looks into the impact of either being stopped or living in a community where a lot of stops are happening. And it shows that it causes harm to individuals, particularly youth, such as increased suicidal ideation, anxiety, depression, insomnia, and it impacted those who just live in neighborhoods where there's high number of stops, not just those who are actually stopped. So there's a cost for every stop that is being made that often is not really considered or factored into whether or not this particular police tactic is valuable or bringing benefit. It's only considers how many arrests are made or whatever, but each stop has been, an interruption of someone's life, a potential opportunity for violence, possibly subjecting someone to fines and fees that are really unnecessary because the underlying conduct doesn't increase any public safety, et cetera, et cetera. So the push is really to limit contacts. And if safety is the goal, proactive policing, which is what we see with when you have upwards of 84% of stops being officer initiated, is not effective at making communities more safe. With respect to traffic safety, because most of these stops are happening in the traffic context, it's more effective if we're trying to avoid harm and actually improve traffic safety rather than just punish people for doing bad things. It's more effective to make changes to the built environment to prevent or make more difficult many of the driving behaviors that lead to harm, many of which are also present in other countries, like protecting pedestrians or making it difficult to attain certain speeds that are unsafe, et cetera. So little time is actually spent responding to calls for help. And yet often when community calls for help, there are complaints that officers are slow to respond or don't respond. And we've heard kind of anecdotally statements made from officers saying they can't respond because they've been defunded, despite what we've seen with a lot of these police budgets actually going up. So shifting resources to responding to calls for help rather than proactively stopping people for minor offenses will, I think, be also better at reducing unnecessary contacts with police. So whether that's not deploying people in certain ways, reducing the number of officers. There was a study that was cited also in the report the ACLU released that when an agency reduces the number of officers, it only decreased the number of minor misdemeanor stops that were made. So it didn't impact the number of stops or arrests for serious offenses. So it's when there's more resources for an agency and more officers on the street, those officers tend to be directed to these kind of quality of life policing, traffic policing, often with the intent of discovering evidence of other crimes that may or may not have occurred.
Thank you. So going into the questions, I'm going to go over some submitted by members in the audience. We have one that says, you mentioned reducing police contact with the public to reduce harm since implicit bias trainings weren't very effective. What about police community outreach? My area has events like Taco with the Cop, where the police department provides food and facilitates conversation between officers and the public. That's a question. Would either of you like to respond?
I mean, I could give my kind of anecdotal, I don't have any stats to back it up, but I do think that if the only time a police officer is engaging with the community is when they're arresting somebody or stopping somebody or giving someone a citation, that kind of thing. Then that's a very negative experience. And so, if you don't have any positive, one of the benefits of having, I think, police officers who come from the community they're serving is an important aspect that a police department should try to make sure they have it because they're aware, they live there, they're aware, and they've got ties to the community, and hopefully more likely to be more active. Don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to me, as a community member in my county for 30 some odd years and being a public servant, part of doing that was the fact that I was invested in my community and I was invested in the criminal justice system working effectively and working fairly, and to reduce harm. So I think there's something to be said about that, but I don't have any statistics that would back that up.
Thank you.
A little bit different take on it too, because I think what Tamani's kind of alluding to also was that these police community interactions that are in that way kind of help the community view police better or understand police in different ways, which is definitely a possibility. But I think when you're driving these disparities that we see, it has nothing to do with what the community is doing. It's 100% on what the officer is doing, what stops the officer is making. So it's, meeting 5 members of the community at a taco event is not going to stop the officer from making 100 stops in that community for hanging a tree hanging from the rearview mirror, or out of like excessive tin, or other minor things that really aren't causing harm, but are for the purpose of investigating other crimes. And having a taco with a cop prior doesn't also stop that individual from feeling like they may be subject of serious harm during that incident. I believe, was it the San Francisco Police Department? I think they ended up shooting their anti-bias trainer at an event, I think with like rubber bullets or something, but at like a protest. So I mean, obviously knowing the cops and having the cops know you is not sufficient protection for having these interactions with the police. So again, there's so many negative outcomes that could arise from stops if they're not really pushing public safety, if there's not an actual public safety gain, especially when you consider all the downsides of that stop, the cost to the public to subsidize these actions, the psychological cost to the individual, the possible financial costs, et cetera, then I think there's really no positive way to do it. There's really no justification for that action as a community if we're trying to do the best for our community collectively.
Got it. Thank you. Another question says, how do we ensure that our local law enforcement agencies are in fact complying with RIPA requirements?
I can just quickly say there's not really a way that you can confirm that they're complying, although you can look at the data and you can see if it, again, passes the smell test. You can do analyses of your local departments. But we ended up not including a use of force analysis in the LASD data because we saw that they had reported, I think, maybe 5 shootings, and we knew LASD had upwards of 20 shootings, and the majority of people that they said they had shot were white, when we knew the majority of people were actually Latino. So having that personal knowledge of your community and what's going on, and even just checking things, that might allow you to have a better sense of does this data seem accurate even, and then taking any next steps for that, or calling for local, if you do have local oversight body, calling on them to do an audit with whatever resources they have at their disposal.
Thank you. There's another question that says, Melanie mentioned reason for the stop and the result of the stop. To be clear, must the peace officer indicate both? Is it illegal to not report either?
So the way that the form is set up is that certain things you have to fill out before you can move forward, and certain things are optional. I believe you have to say the basis for the stop, like if it's reasonable suspicion or traffic. You do not have to always say the offense code for the reasonable suspicion. So you might just say reasonable suspicion, or you might say reasonable suspicion trespassing, or reasonable suspicion blah blah blah. Like so that is an optional thing. The arrest though is mandatory to say what the offense code was for.
Are law enforcement agencies required to disclose actions they will take to reduce the biased actions that they make?
Well, I think
Either-
the, I'm sorry, I think that, you know, the RIPA report, you know, submits recommendations for, you know, based on the analysis of recommendations of what law enforcement agencies should try and do in order to reduce harm and facilitate positive community ties. But I don't know that there may be some other than the reporting requirements. Melanie probably would know better than me. I don't know that there's any mandatory, there's been any kind of, that there's the RIPA report is mandating anything on police agencies. Some police agencies are adopting the recommendations, you know, in a good faith effort to try to, you know, reduce the harm and the impact, and you know, kind of create more positive community ties. But it's still just usually like one or two things that's adopted, and it's like, hey, pat me on the back, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's not how it goes. You know, you got to work on everything, and you have to really take to heart the recommendations in the RIPA report, because, you know, police agencies, you know, you can't an agency, an institution like policing can't come from the very racist roots of lynching police or slave patrols, and then miraculously, in some way, shape, or form, you know, make its way out of it without ever having actually addressed it and acknowledged it. And that's just starting to happen. You know, it's not something that has happened in the 400 years of, you know, starting with the slave patrols. So you can't make it an innately and inherently racist institution a non-racist institution without doing some work.
Someone else wrote, the Marin County Sheriff's Office stopped disparities of Latinx and Black people were among the highest of all 58 reporting agencies in California. Sheriff Scardina has publicly stated that he does not regard the RIPA data as accurate or worthwhile. This is the Marin County Sheriff's Office official stance. How do community activists combat this, even when the data is right in front of him or them? He says the cops don't know a person's race in advance of the stops and added this box to forms. What happens when RIPA is rejected?
So that's always the struggle with advocacy, right? You're trying to convince someone to change, and they may or may not accept your argument, even if it's the right one, right? I think the best strategy for folks who are unable to make those moves in their local jurisdiction is to support statewide legislation. So there was proposals to limit consent searches, limit pretext searches that were moving in the state at the state level this year. And if those were passed, that would, Marin County would be, you know, bound by that state law. So it wouldn't be a question of just their local agencies' willingness to comply. It's, you know, they're required by state law too. So that really, I think, is the best strategy, is to try to get tied into state legislative work, so that you can put your energy and efforts into mobilizing your community to support that type of work, so that the agencies would still have to comply even if they don't want to.
Thank you. Do school resource officers have to fill in a RIPA form? Would those be discoverable through a Public Records Act request?
Sorry, so all RIPA data is discoverable in a PRA. So yes, SROs, I do not believe that they meet this. There's a statutory definition of peace officers, that I don't have right at my fingertips. I'm not sure if they meet that, but school police do. I don't know if SROs generally are the same, because they're often different. They're different from local police, school police agencies. So I would have to look into that. But if they meet the definition of peace officers and they're conducting stops, then yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then tied to that, someone wrote, how can parents concerned about school shooting and weapons and guns on campus feel the safety of a school resource officer without having the high probability of having a school resource officer with implicit bias on campus? More school counseling or private / non-law enforcement security?
I don't have a specific
And then
answer.
we, sorry to interrupt, but it looks like one of the clean members, Carl, wrote that school resource officers are sworn law enforcement officers.
And my concern with having law enforcement on school campuses is that then they're relied upon to deal with kind of social counseling or more social work, more things that social workers would be better at doing. And really, school resource officers came about when desegregation came about. So when Black kids started going to white schools, then now I need a law enforcement officer on campus, kind of thing. So you have to understand when something comes from this kind of has these racist roots, and understand that while I do think that there are school resource officers who are truly trying to do the right thing, putting law enforcement on a campus doesn't stop school shootings, as we see, and only really reinforces the punishment and crime and punishment in an environment that's supposed to be assisting people with growth and healthy growth. And so there's nothing to me that is necessary about SROs. And I think, it's just something that it started for a very racist reason. And then we just kept saying, well, you need to do it. You have to, and so then it just became the status quo. And now we're like, well, what else should we do? And it's clearly not working, because there's no studies that show having a law enforcement officer on campus reduces crime, violence, what have you, that I'm aware of. As a matter of fact, I think some of the statistics suggest that make it worse.
And just adding on what Tamani said, if you're interested in this topic, if you look at the 2023 report, there was an extensive discussion on the history of school police, and talking exactly what Tamani was referencing as the kind of the racist roots of how it began.
Thank you. I'm gonna go back up to the list. We have one that says, please discuss the pluses and minuses of using the following methods to analyze stop data. Census residential benchmarks is number 1. Number 2, licensed driver data. Number 3, traffic accident data. Number 4, traffic violation data. And number 5, the veil of darkness model. And you can, that's in our Q&A box. It's the very first question that was submitted.
So I definitely couldn't tell you off the top of my head all of the positives and negatives from each of those. I'll just explain briefly the veil of darkness model. Folks who are unfamiliar with that, that's basically kind of trying to create a natural experiment by looking at who stopped during different times of the year, but at the same time of day. So ostensibly you're getting the same people traversing the particular area throughout the whole year. But at certain parts of the year, it's dark at that time. In certain parts of the year, it's light at that time. So the argument is that officers can better tell the race of an individual in the stops that are made during the daytime when it's light versus stops that are made when it's dark. And if the same kind of trends are seen in both the day and night, or light and dark stops, then it's probably not based on race. One of the big criticisms of that is that race is, there are often lots of proxies for race. And class, right? So the type of vehicle that someone drives, other markers on the vehicle can often be things that are also used to identify or presume an identity of someone before they stop them. So that's one of the big kind of question marks of the veil of darkness, is that even if you don't actually see the person, are you still making presumptions about their race based on their vehicle or other things that they're doing?
You. And there are some questions that we kind of touched on throughout the discussion. So I think we'll probably close it off with the last question, which is, how do we set up a RIPA committee in our community, considering the importance of RIPA?
I would recommend, we have board meetings, we have subcommittee meetings, those are open to the public. So I think, getting people together to first, start attending and listening and asking questions, is a good starting point. But community development probably, organization development is probably more up Melanie's alley of knowledge.
So I would say it depends on, I don't know exactly what you mean by RIPA committee, what you're trying to accomplish with that. As Tamani said, if you're interested in engaging in the RIPA report being created and that data, definitely join our meetings. They're open to the public. Public can comment, public can submit comments. There's also, but if you're interested in basically using the RIPA data in your local community in ways to advocate, you don't need to do anything formal to do that. You can just pull the data and start doing analysis. You could maybe, if you're looking for people who are able to do that work, maybe look to local colleges, universities to see if there might be a partnership that you could make with your organization or you as an individual with a department or institute or professor there who may want to also be willing to do the analysis of the work of the data. I'm sorry, because it's definitely it's not totally for the faint of heart starting to dig into the RIPA data, but I mean it is doable, but it's difficult. But I mean, and also connecting with if you want to connect with the ACLU, either wherever you are, if you're in Northern California, there's a ACLU of Northern California. I'm at the ACLU of Southern California. That would, if you're on our mailing list, you'll find information about some of our legislative work that's happening that relies on the RIPA data and is pushing some of these things. So that's one way to potentially be in the loop in terms of what's happening statewide or even locally, that's kind of around some of this work.
Thank you. So ladies, do you have any closing remarks? We really learned a lot in this discussion and you provided us with very valuable information. We'd like to thank you for your time and participating and being here with us tonight.
Thank you. And, I'm glad to be invited and to be able to kind of answer questions and kind of clarify any issues that the community might have. So I really appreciate you guys having this platform for Melanie and I to come and kind of, address these very important issues that are affecting every community.
Ditto. Thank you for having us. And I really just put another plug in for people getting involved with the RIPA board so they're up to date on kind of what's going on. Public comments are definitely listened to and engage with. I think they just put the link to the website so that you can sign up to get notice of meetings and agendas in advance so that you can participate as your schedule allows.
Thank you. And then I'll close off by saying that the Community Advisory Council for IOLERO has an ad hoc that's analyzing the RIPA data that was submitted to the Department of Justice. So individuals are welcome to attend those meetings as well. Thank you everyone so much for being with us here tonight and for participating. And yeah, everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Good night all.